The November morning arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made the prairie grass brittle as glass. Frost painted intricate patterns across the single window of the small homestead that sat like a lonely island in the vast Montana territory. Inside, 8-year-old Tommy Morrison stood beside the wooden bed where his mother lay perfectly still, her face pale as winter wheat. "Mama can't wake up," he whispered to his 4-year-old sister Sarah, whose tiny fingers were wrapped tightly around his calloused hand. The little girl's eyes, wide and confused, searched her brother's face for answers he didn't have. Tommy had been trying to wake their mother since dawn broke 2 hours ago. He'd shaken her gently at first, then more urgently calling, "Mama, Mama," until his voice cracked. But Martha Morrison remained motionless, her breathing so shallow it was barely visible beneath the worn quilt their grandmother had sewn years before. The house felt different today, emptier somehow, despite nothing having changed in its sparse furnishings. The iron stove sat cold and dark in the corner, no warmth radiating from its belly. The smell of yesterday's cornbread still lingered faintly, but underneath it was something else, something that made Tommy's stomach twist with a fear he couldn't name. Sarah tugged on his sleeve. "Tommy, I'm hungry," she said, her voice small and uncertain. Her curly brown hair was tangled from sleep, and she still wore the faded blue dress that served as both her day clothes and nightgown. "I know, Sissy, I'll make her something," Tommy replied, though he wasn't sure how. Mama had always done the cooking, always done everything. His father had died of fever 3 years ago, leaving them alone on this isolated patch of land 15 miles from the nearest neighbor. As Tommy led Sarah to the kitchen area, he caught sight of the empty medicine bottles on the rough-hewn table. Doc Henderson had brought them last week when Mama's cough got worse, but they hadn't seemed to help. The doctor had looked worried when he left, whispering something to Mama about making arrangements that Tommy hadn't understood then. The sound of hoofbeats outside made both children freeze. Tommy's heart hammered as he peered through the frosted window. A lone rider approached through the morning mist, his breath and his horses creating small clouds in the frigid air. The man sat tall in his saddle, wearing a weathered leather coat and a hat pulled low against the wind. "Stay here, Sarah," Tommy instructed, moving protectively in front of his sister. He'd heard stories of drifters and outlaws, and with Mama unable to help them, he was all that stood between danger and his little sister. The rider dismounted and approached the door with measured steps. His knock was firm but not threatening. "Hello in there," came a deep voice, roughened by years of weather and hard living. "Name's Jake Brennan. I was riding through and saw the place looked quiet. Everything all right?" Tommy's throat felt dry as sand. Through the thin door he could hear the man's horse snorting and stamping in the cold. What should he say? If he told the truth, what would happen to them? But if he lied and the man went away, what then? Sarah pressed against his back, and he could feel her trembling. Whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. The decision was made for him when she called out in her clear, innocent voice, "Tommy says Mama can't wake up." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Then the man's voice came again, gentler this time, filled with a concern that somehow made Tommy's eyes burn with unshed tears. "Son, I'm coming in. Don't be afraid." Jake Brennan had seen enough of frontier life to recognize tragedy when it stared him in the face. The two children huddled together in the dim cabin, the boy trying to be brave, the little girl clinging to him like he was her anchor in a storm, told him everything he needed to know before he even approached the bed where their mother lay. He knelt beside Martha Morrison, his weathered hand gentle as he checked for signs of life he already knew he wouldn't find. The woman had been gone for hours, probably since sometime in the night. Consumption, most likely, based on the medicine bottles and the way her thin frame seemed lost beneath the covers. "What's your name, son?" Jake asked softly, turning to face the boy who watched him with eyes too old for his young face. "Tommy Morrison, sir. This is my sister Sarah." The boy's voice wavered but held steady. Is she going to be okay?" Jake had delivered news like this before, to grown men who'd lost partners, to women who'd lost husbands, but never to children who'd lost everything. He looked into Tommy's hopeful, terrified eyes and made a decision that would change all their lives. "Come here, both of you," he said, settling cross-legged on the rough plank floor. When they approached hesitantly, he spoke with the kind of honest gentleness his own father had used with injured animals. "Your mama was very sick, wasn't she? She'd been coughing, having trouble breathing." Tommy nodded, tears finally beginning to fall. Doc Henderson came, but his medicine didn't help much. She kept getting weaker. "Sometimes," Jake said carefully, "when people are that sick for that long, their bodies just stop fighting. It doesn't mean they wanted to leave you. It just means they were too tired to stay." Sarah, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly burst into tears. "I want Mama to wake up. I want her to make breakfast." Jake's chest tightened as he watched Tommy wrap his arms around his sister, his own tears falling freely now. These children were alone in the world, 15 miles from the nearest help, with winter coming on hard and fast. "Do you have any family?" Jake asked. "Aunts, uncles, grandparents?" Tommy shook his head. "Papa died when I was 5. Mama said all our people were back east, but we never heard from them after Papa passed." The wind rattled the cabin's single window, and Jake could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. A blizzard was coming. He could feel it in his bones. These children wouldn't survive a week alone out here, especially not with winter setting in. "Here's what we're going to do," Jake said, his mind already forming a plan. "I'm going to take care of things here, and then we're going to pack up what you need. You're coming with me." Tommy's eyes widened with alarm. "Where? We don't know you, mister. Mama always said not to go with strangers." "Your mama was smart," Jake replied, "and she was right to teach you that. But sometimes, when things get really bad, you have to make hard choices." He met Tommy's gaze directly. "I've got a ranch about 30 miles north of here. It's not much, but it's warm and safe. My name is Jake Brennan, and I give you my word as a man of God that I'll take care of you both until we can figure out something better." Sarah had stopped crying and was studying Jake with the intense scrutiny only small children could manage. "Do you have horses?" she asked suddenly. Despite everything, Jake found himself smiling. "I do. 3 of them, and some cattle, and a dog named Rusty who's probably wondering where I disappeared to." "I like dogs," Sarah said solemnly. Tommy was still suspicious, but Jake could see the boy was also practical enough to recognize their situation. "What about Mama? We can't just leave her." "We won't," Jake assured him. "First thing we'll do is ride to town and tell the sheriff and the preacher. They'll take proper care of your mama, make sure she has a good burial in the church cemetery. Then we'll come back for your things." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Jake rode his horse hard to reach Willow Creek's small town center, where Sheriff Davis and Reverend Mitchell immediately organized a proper burial party. By evening, Martha Morrison was laid to rest beside her husband in the little cemetery behind the white clapboard church, with Jake standing behind the 2 children as they said their goodbyes. As they rode away from the only home they'd ever known, Sarah asleep in Jake's arms and Tommy riding double behind him, Jake wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He'd been alone for 15 years, ever since his own wife and infant son had died of scarlet fever. He'd sworn then that he'd never again open his heart to the kind of pain that came with loving people you could lose. But looking down at Sarah's peaceful face and feeling Tommy's small arms wrapped around his waist for warmth, Jake realized it was already too late for such resolutions. 3 weeks into December, the Brennan Ranch felt like a different world to Tommy Morrison. The house was larger than their old cabin, with 2 real bedrooms, a kitchen with a proper wood-burning stove, and even a small parlor with 2 chairs and a bookshelf filled with more books than Tommy had ever seen in one place. But it wasn't the house that amazed him most. It was watching Jake Brennan navigate the daily routine of caring for 2 children with the same quiet competence he showed breaking horses or mending fence. Eggs need to be gathered every morning. Jake explained patiently for the third time that week as they walked to the chicken coop through the crisp morning air. Chickens are creatures of habit. They like their routine, and so do we. Tommy nodded, still getting used to having actual chores that mattered. Back home, Mama had tried to give him little tasks, but she'd often end up doing them herself when he struggled. Jake was different. He showed Tommy how to do something once, helped him practice it twice, and then expected him to do it on his own. "Why do you trust me with important stuff?" Tommy asked, as he carefully placed eggs in the wicker basket. Jake paused in his task of filling the water trough. "Because you're capable of important stuff. Being young doesn't mean being helpless." It was the kind of simple answer that somehow made Tommy stand a little straighter. Sarah had adapted to ranch life with the resilience of the very young. She followed Rusty, Jake's aging border collie, around the property like he was her personal guardian. The dog, who'd been Jake's only companion for years, seemed to understand his new responsibility and rarely let the little girl out of his sight. "Jake," Sarah announced one morning at breakfast, "Rusty says we should get more dogs." Jake raised an eyebrow, cutting into his fried eggs. "Rusty told you that, did he?" "Uh-huh. He says the ranch is too big for just one dog to watch properly." Tommy saw the corner of Jake's mouth twitch with suppressed laughter. "Well, if Rusty thinks so, I guess we'll have to consider it. But first, we need to make sure we can take proper care of the animals we already have." These conversations had become routine, Jake treating both children's ideas with respect while gently teaching them about responsibility and consequences. It was so different from the constant worry that had filled their old house, where Mama had been too tired and sick to do much more than make sure they were fed and safe. But Tommy still woke up some nights, forgetting where he was, expecting to hear his mother's labored breathing from the next room. On those nights, he'd lie in the darkness of his new bedroom, overwhelmed by the silence and the strangeness of having his own space. One such night in late December, he slipped out of bed and padded to the kitchen for a drink of water. He was surprised to find Jake sitting at the table, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him, staring out the window at the snow-covered landscape. "Can't sleep either?" Jake asked without turning around. Tommy shook his head, then remembered Jake couldn't see him. "No, sir, I keep thinking about things." "Want to talk about those things?" Tommy got his water and hesitated. Over the past month, Jake had proven himself to be exactly what he'd promised, a safe haven in the storm of their loss. But some thoughts felt too big and scary to say out loud. "I keep worrying," Tommy finally admitted, settling into the chair across from Jake. "What if you change your mind about us? What if we're too much trouble?" Jake turned to look at him then, his weathered face serious in the lamplight. "Tommy, has anyone ever told you about choosing your family? You can't choose family. Family is just family." "Well, that's one way to look at it. But I think family is also the people who show up for each other when things get hard, the people who stick around even when it's difficult or inconvenient." Jake leaned forward slightly. "You and Sarah, you're not just staying here because you need help. You're here because I want you here, because you make this place feel like a home instead of just a house." Tommy felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. "Really? Really? And Tommy, I need you to know something else. Your mama, she did a good job raising you. You take care of Sarah like you're already the man of the house. You work hard, you don't complain, and you're trying to figure out how to fit into a new life without forgetting the old one. That takes courage." For the first time since his mother's death, Tommy felt something other than grief and fear. He felt proud. Not proud in a boastful way, but proud in the way that comes from being seen and valued by someone who matters. "Jake," Tommy said, as they prepared to return to their beds. "Thank you for everything." Jake ruffled Tommy's hair in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "That's what family does, son. That's what family does." Outside, the December wind howled across the prairie, but inside the warm ranch house, three people who'd found each other in tragedy were slowly learning to become something new together. By the time spring arrived in the Montana Territory, the Brennan Ranch had settled into rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. Tommy had grown 3 inches and developed the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing he belonged somewhere. Sarah had learned to gather eggs, feed the chickens, and help with simple cooking tasks, all while maintaining a running commentary that kept both Jake and Tommy entertained throughout their long days. "The apple tree is budding," Sarah announced one April morning, pressing her nose against the kitchen window. "Rusty and I counted 17 buds yesterday." 18, Tommy corrected, grinning at his sister. "You missed the one on the backside of the lowest branch." Jake watched this exchange while packing supplies for their monthly trip to town. These trips had become important milestones, opportunities for the children to maintain connections with the wider community, and for Jake to handle business that couldn't be managed from the ranch. "Mr. Brennan," Sarah had started calling him Jake after the first week, despite his gentle corrections, "can we visit Mama's grave today?" The question still came regularly, and Jake had learned to answer it with the same patient kindness every time. "Of course we can. We'll pick some of those early wildflowers she loved." These cemetery visits had become easier over the months, transforming from heartbreaking goodbyes into peaceful conversations. Tommy would tell his mother about his chores and his growing skill with horses. Sarah would chatter about Rusty and the chickens and the games she played, and Jake would stand quietly nearby, offering them space to grieve while ensuring they never felt alone in it. "Jake," Tommy said as they hitched the wagon for the journey to town, "Sheriff Davis asked me last month if we were thinking about making things official. What did he mean?" Jake paused in adjusting the harness. He'd been expecting this conversation for weeks. "He meant adoption papers, legal documents that would make you and Sarah officially my children, not just children I'm caring for." Sarah looked up sharply from where she was helping load their supplies. "What's adoption?" "It means," Tommy said slowly, working through the concept, "that Jake would be our new papa. Legally, I mean." "But what about our real papa?" Sarah asked, confusion clouding her features. Jake knelt down to her level, his expression gentle but serious. "Your real papa will always be your papa, Sarah. Nothing can change that. And your mama will always be your mama. But adoption would mean that I promise to take care of you and Tommy for the rest of your lives, even when you're grown up. It would mean you're Brennans now, officially." Tommy felt his throat tighten with emotion. Over the past 5 months, he'd wondered about this possibility, but had been afraid to hope for it. Do you want to adopt us?" "Ugum, more than anything," Jake replied without hesitation. "But it has to be what you want too, both of you. It's a big decision." Sarah didn't hesitate. "I want to be Sarah Brennan," she declared. "Can I still visit Mama and Papa's graves?" "Every month, for as long as you want to," Jake promised. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, watching his sister's excitement and feeling the weight of speaking for both of them. Finally, he looked up at Jake with eyes that held wisdom beyond his 9 years. "I think," he said carefully, "Mama would want us to have a family again, a real family, and I think you're already our family anyway. The papers would just make it official." Jake's eyes grew suspiciously bright. "Then that's what we'll do. Today, when we're in town, we'll talk to the lawyer about starting the process." The adoption proceedings took 6 weeks to complete, during which time the entire community of Willow Creek seemed to rally around the small family. Reverend Mitchell spoke eloquently about the blessing of choosing to love. Doc Henderson, who'd known Martha Morrison, told Jake privately that he'd never seen 2 children recover from loss so completely. Even Mrs. Henderson, the town's most formidable gossip, admitted that Jake Brennan had surprised everyone by turning out to have a heart. On a warm day in late May, Judge Patterson made it official in a simple ceremony at the courthouse. Tommy Morrison and Sarah Morrison became Thomas Brennan and Sarah Brennan, surrounded by half the town and with Rusty waiting patiently outside. That evening, back at the ranch, Jake found Tommy sitting on the front porch steps, staring out at the sunset-painted prairie. Regrets? Jake asked, settling beside his newly official son. Tommy shook his head. No regrets, just thinking about how different everything is from last winter. Different how? Last winter, when Mama was sick, everything felt like it was ending. Like our whole world was just shrinking until there was nothing left. Tommy paused, gathering his thoughts. But it wasn't ending. It was just changing into something else, something better. From inside the house came the sound of Sarah giggling as she played with Rusty, and the simple domesticity of dinner preparations. It was the sound of home, not the desperate quiet of their old cabin, but the comfortable noise of a family living their lives together. Your mama would be proud of you, Jake said quietly. Both of you. You've honored her memory by learning how to be happy again. Tommy leaned against Jake's shoulder in a gesture that had become natural over the months. Do you think she knows about us being a family now? Jake looked up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. I think love doesn't just disappear when people die. I think it finds new ways to keep working in the world, and I think your mama's love helped lead you to where you needed to be. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, listening to Sarah's laughter and watching the lights begin to flicker on in the windows of their neighbors miles away, Tommy realized that Jake was right. Love didn't disappear. It transformed, adapted, found new expressions and new homes. The little boy who'd stood beside his sister last November saying, "Mama can't wake up," was gone. In his place was Thomas Brennan, son and brother and heir to a ranch that stretched toward the horizon, blessed with a family that had chosen each other through the worst of times and emerged stronger on the other side. Some stories end with loss, others begin there. This was one that did both. The August sun blazed high over the Brennan Ranch as Thomas Brennan, now 29 and weathered by 2 decades of frontier life, guided his mare through the familiar gates. Behind him rode his wife Elena, her dark hair braided beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and their 5-year-old son Michael, who bore the same serious eyes that Thomas had possessed as a child. "There's the house, mijo," Elena said softly to their son, pointing toward the expanded homestead that now boasted a wraparound porch and a second story. "Your grandfather Jake built most of it with his own hands." Michael nodded solemnly, though his attention was captured by the sight of several horses grazing in the near pasture. At 5, he was already showing the same natural affinity for animals that seemed to run in the Brennan family, chosen though it may be. Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied these visits home. Not sadness exactly, but the complex emotion of a man who'd traveled far from his origins yet remained forever anchored to them. He'd spent the last 7 years in California, first learning advanced ranching techniques, then building his own modest spread in the San Joaquin Valley. But Montana would always be home. "Papa Jake," Michael called out as a figure emerged from the barn. Jake Brennan, now 65, his hair silver-white beneath his ever-present hat, but his stride still strong and purposeful. Behind him bounded Rusty Jr., the grandson of the original Rusty, who'd welcomed 2 frightened children so long ago. "There's my boy," Jake called back, his voice carrying the same warmth it had held for 20 years. He caught Michael as the child launched himself from the saddle, spinning him around before setting him down gently. "You've grown 3 inches since Christmas, I'll wager." "No, 4.5, Michael corrected seriously. "Mama measured." Elena laughed as she dismounted, embracing her father-in-law with genuine affection. "Jake, you look wonderful. The ranch agrees with you. Retirement agrees with me," Jake replied with a grin, "though I use the term loosely. Hard to truly retire when you've got 200 head of cattle and a stubborn old bull who thinks he runs the place." Thomas studied his adoptive father's face, looking for signs of the illness that had brought them rushing home from California. 3 months ago, Doc Henderson, now Doc Henderson Jr., And as his father had passed 5 years prior, had written to say that Jake had suffered what appeared to be a minor heart episode. But looking at him now, Thomas could see only the vital, capable man who'd saved 2 orphaned children from certain death. "Where's Sarah?" Thomas asked, scanning the area for his sister. "In town with little Martha and James," Jake replied. "She'll be back for supper. That schoolteacher husband of hers has been helping the new preacher organize a library for the church. Sarah's become quite the advocate for education, you know." Thomas smiled. His sister had surprised everyone by marrying David Mitchell, the nephew of their old Reverend Mitchell, who'd come west to establish schools in frontier communities. Sarah had thrown herself into the work with characteristic enthusiasm, becoming the unofficial coordinator of educational efforts across 3 counties. 2 children and still trying to teach every child in Montana Territory to read, Elena observed fondly. "That sounds like Sarah." They walked toward the house together, Michael chattering excitedly about the journey, while Rusty Jr. provided enthusiastic escort. The porch was adorned with Elena's trademark touch, flower boxes that Sarah had maintained in their absence, blooming with hardy frontier varieties that could withstand both drought and sudden storms. As they settled around the familiar kitchen table, expanded now to accommodate a growing family, Jake poured coffee for the adults and milk for Michael. The ritual was so familiar that Thomas could close his eyes and be 9 years old again, listening to Jake explain the day's work while Sarah announced her latest discovery or scheme. "Tell me honestly," Thomas said, once Michael had wandered outside to explore the barn with the dog. "How are you feeling? Don't give me the speech you gave Doc Henderson." Jake was quiet for a moment, studying his coffee cup. At 65, he'd earned every line on his weathered face, every gray hair beneath his hat. "I won't lie to you, son. Some mornings I feel every one of my years. The heart episode was a warning. Doc Henderson made that clear enough, but I'm not ready to be put out to pasture quite yet." "That's not what we're asking," Elena said gently. "We're asking if you want help, real help, not just visits." Thomas reached across the table to touch his father's hand. "Elena and I have been talking. The California ranch is doing well enough that we could sell it, move back here permanently. Michael should grow up knowing his grandfather and you miss this place," Jake finished with a knowing smile. "I can see it in your eyes every time you visit. You've done well for yourself in California, Thomas, but your heart never left Montana." It was true, though Thomas had never spoken it aloud. Every morning in California, he'd found himself looking north toward the mountains, thinking about the changing seasons on the home ranch, wondering if Jake was managing the spring roundup without strain, if Sarah's children were learning to ride the gentle mares in the back pasture. "The ranch needs younger hands," Jake continued, "and I'll admit, the idea of having family close again, well, it's appealing to an old man who spent too many evenings talking to dogs and cattle." Eleanor squeezed Thomas's hand under the table. They'd talked about this possibility during the long wagon journey from California, weighing the practical considerations against the pull of family and familiar ground. Elena had grown to love the ranch during their visits, and she understood the deep roots that bound Thomas to this place. "There's something else," Jake said, his voice taking on a more formal tone. "I've been working with the lawyers in town on updating my will. When I'm gone, I want this place to pass to both you and Sarah equally. She and David have their own homestead, but this land, this should stay in the family." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Jake, you don't need to think about such things yet. A man my age needs to think about exactly such things," Jake replied firmly. "I want to see you settled here again while I'm still around to help with the transition. I want to watch Michael learn to rope cattle and break horses. I want to argue with Sarah about her latest educational crusade over Sunday dinner." The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. Sarah arrived in a flurry of motion and laughter, her 6-year-old daughter Martha chattering excitedly, while 3-year-old James dozed against his mother's shoulder. Behind them rode David Mitchell, his quiet dignity a perfect complement to Sarah's vibrant energy. "Thomas!" Sarah called out, practically leaping from her wagon before it came to a complete stop. At 24, she'd grown into the spirited, capable woman that Jake had always predicted she would become. "Elena, and where's my nephew?" The reunion was everything Thomas had remembered from childhood. Sarah's enthusiastic embrace, the rapid-fire questions about their journey, the easy affection that had always characterized their family bonds. Little Martha, shy at first, warmed quickly to her California cousins, while James woke up long enough to charm everyone with his sleepy smile. As evening approached and the family gathered around the expanded dinner table, Thomas found himself studying the faces around him. Jake, silver-haired, but still commanding respect with his quiet authority. Sarah, animated as she described her latest efforts to establish a lending library in 3 neighboring towns. David, thoughtful and supportive, contributing dry humor to the conversation. Elena, fitting seamlessly into the family dynamic as she helped manage the children. And the little ones, Michael, Martha, and James, representing the next generation of Brennans, growing up with the security and love that he and Sarah had found here 20 years ago. "Jake," Thomas said as the conversation lulled, "Elena and I have made our decision. We'd like to come home permanently." Weird. The smile that spread across Jake's weathered face could have lit the entire Montana territory. "Well then," he said, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast, "I guess we'd better start planning for a busy harvest season." Later that evening, as the family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. From 2 terrified children standing beside their mother's deathbed to a thriving family spanning 2 generations, it seemed impossible that so much joy could have grown from such devastating loss. "Do you ever think about them?" Sarah asked quietly, settling beside him on the porch steps as she had countless times in their childhood. "Mama and Papa, every day," Thomas replied, "but not with sadness anymore. I think about how they'd feel seeing all this, seeing you with your family, seeing Michael grow up here. I think they'd be proud of what we became." Sarah leaned against his shoulder in the familiar gesture of siblings who'd weathered life's storms together. "I think so too, and I think they'd love Jake like we do. They'd understand why we're Brennans now, even though we'll always be their children too." From inside the house came the sound of Jake telling one of his famous stories to the children, his voice carrying the same warmth and wisdom that had guided them through their darkest days. Elena and David were cleaning up from dinner, their quiet conversation punctuated by comfortable laughter. As the stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky, Thomas realized that this was what healing looked like. Not the absence of loss, but the transformation of grief into gratitude, of ending into beginning. The scared little boy who'd held his sister's hand and whispered, "Mama can't wake up," had grown into a man capable of building new life from the ashes of the old. The ranch would continue, strengthened by new hands and young hearts. The family would grow and change and face whatever challenges the frontier threw at them. And somewhere in the quiet cemetery behind the white church in town, 2 graves would continue to be visited and tended by children who'd learned that love doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to flourish. Some stories end with tragedy. Others begin there and become testaments to the unbreakable resilience of the human heart. This was one of those stories, still being written with each sunrise over the rolling hills of home.